Hi, my friend is staying with me and he watches podcasts like on the internet TV. I just witnessed for the first time Kill Tony podcast with, I guess, Tony Hinchcliffe as the host. Apparently, this Kill Tony podcast is the #1 podcast in the United States. This podcast, the Kill Tony podcast, which I'm giving, I guess, publicity to right now, should not be the #1 podcast in the United States. I believe that it should not even be a podcast with the material that has been thrown around, like the first time that I've ever seen it. Now, they have comedians come on, at least in this episode they did. This had great comedians, okay? I asked my friend, I'm like, the host, like, what is he doing? Like, why is he saying these things? And I'll get to that in a minute. The comedians were great, and my friend says, oh, like the comedians come on and then he roasts them, you know what I mean? Like, and then he was throwing words around, like one comedian came on, one particular gentleman was on there, and I guess this Tony Hinchcliffe that I don't believe has much talent at all. I think there might have been like a time, like particularly where he had talent, and then now, I don't mean to be that way, like that sounds really rude, but one particular gentleman that did comedy came on there. This Tony, like, was making fun of his appearance and saying, like, and he said like 12 times in a row, oh wow man, like you really look like a pedophile. Oh wow, you've got that pedophile look to you. Gee man, I wouldn't be surprised if you were the biggest pedophile. Like, and my friend's kind of laughing, and I'm like, whoa, if I was that guy, and the guy kind of was like getting uncomfortable because this host Tony was saying like more than once in the same segment, like the word pedophile, which there's a comedian called Joe Rogan. It is not the Joe Rogan from the Joe Rogan podcast, okay? That is a kind of 100% completely different Joe Rogan. There is a comedian named Joe Rogan, and I think that like it just so happens that he has the same name so he can get publicity for like using his name out of like Joe Rogan, like the professional particular gentleman that has the podcast. That's an excellent like podcast guy, like you know who he is. Such inappropriate. He talks about like pedophilia and performing sex acts on children, and that is a different person, but I hope that they're watching him, and I know that they are. But this Tony Hinchcliffe on this Kill Tony podcast, I'm only encouraging you to watch this because for the #1 podcast, I sure never heard of it before. So this like comedian, and like that was his material, that was Tony's material, okay? There was another gentleman that was sitting with this Tony, the host, and he had a shirt, I think, with rainbows on it or something, but he was a straight gentleman. Tony proceeded to call this gentleman a faggot, not once, not twice, just like the pedophile thing. How many times, and that's a word that I do not throw around. It is a British cigarette, you know what I mean? Like, I know that within certain circles, like, it's all right to say that word, like, but I believe that it's really similar to the N-word in like African American culture. It's like, it's a no-no. It's a hate word. The word faggot it's not a pretty word, okay? It's not a word to describe anyone unless, like, I guess you're given permission. Like, when I say, like, you know what, I have friends that it's like, oh, he's a flamer. You know what I mean? Like, there's my friend and he's a fabulous flamer. I don't call my friends faggots. I don't call them faggots jokingly. Just because I know that they're in pain, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not easy to come out and be gay, which is another, like, reason why I think that this particular gentleman, Tony Hinchcliffe, when it comes down to saying, like, you know what? Faggot, 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 I'll say you are. Right? You are, Tony. I'm not trying to be rude and I'm not calling you out, but how does that make you feel? You're not supposed to say things that make people... It's not funny. It's like... It's just not funny. And I think there was one more thing that Tony, the host, like said on this Kill Tony podcast. I encourage you to watch it to see how horrible his material is. Retards. First of all, just because that's an outdated word that nobody uses anymore, because like we actually have, there's mentally challenged, there's mentally gifted, autistic, like in this podcast, and this is one podcast that I watched, throwing the words pedophile at people, throwing the words faggot at people, and then like saying, well, what's more funny than a retard? Nothing's more funny than a retard, right? Show me somebody that's funnier than a retard. Retards are the funny, just over and over and over again, these hateful, ignorant words. Why is this the #1 podcast in America? And how did this Tony, frickin' Hinchcliffe, how did he beat the real Joe Rogan, the not pedophile, frickin' comedy guy Joe Rogan? How did his podcast that is completely ignorant beat out Joe Rogan's podcast, which is the most brilliant, intelligent podcast that's always interesting and never throws around hate words? That was hate speech. I don't care. It's they're roasting, he's roasting, these comedians. That's his, ha 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 ha, that's his thing. No. There used to be, a show with, Dean Martin where people would roast people, or even, the modern show that, I think, was it on MTV, or where they roasted, Justin Bieber and, Charlie Sheen and stuff. That's kind of funny. That's roasting people, right? Calling someone a faggot, calling someone a pedophile, and calling someone a retard over and over again. I can't help but think that this Tony should get some self-esteem about himself. I think he probably doesn't particularly love himself, and it shows. He's not funny. Tony, you're not funny. Okay? He's well, I have the #1 podcast, I'm sure he's calling me some kind of names right now. Oh, I have the #1 podcast right now. You're unstoppable? No, there's people like me that are going to hold you accountable for being ignorant. And he'll be oh, well, Joe Rogan is my friend. Yeah, well, he thinks you're a fucking ass. I can guarantee it. Maybe he used to be friends with you. When was the last time he was on your podcast? You're an ass, dude. You're hurting people. And you know what? Young people are going to watch your podcast since it's the #1 podcast in America. And they're going to say, I don't believe in that. Do you want them to believe in that, Tony? Do you want young people to go around calling each other retards, faggots? And it's not funny to accuse someone of being a pedophile. People get killed in prison for that, dude. So I hope that this might, you're oh, you don't like constructive criticism because you're the #1 podcast. Well, honey, look up the word flamer and see whose picture is next to the word flamer in the dictionary. Peace. Oh, I dropped my notebook. I'm just saying. Ope He's a Flama. Ope He's a Flama. Ope He's a Flama. Ope He's a Flama. Hey, I wrote a song called Ope He's a Flama. Tie him to the tree and light him on fire. Ope He's a Flama. Ope He's a Flama. Right? And you don't want flamers to be mad at you either. See, now I'm getting into comedy now. Don't you ever get in a fight with a flama. That's why it's so am I starting a fight with Tony here? I don't want to get in a fight with Tony. Ope He's a Flama, Ope He's a Flama, Ope He's a Flama, Ope He's a Flama. Right? Dude, and you know that I can say shit like this too. I wrote this song for my friend, actually. Tie him to the tree and light him on fire. That's supposed to be witch trial stuff that is not having to do. See, and you're oh yeah, well you think it. No, everybody knows that I'm talking about witch trial stuff, and I'm talking about frickin', and I have I can do that. Ope He's a Flame, Ope He's a Flamer. Anyway, constructive criticism. Tony, check yourself before you wreck yourself, okay? Honey. All right?